In this, our second week of our second annual Elul series of Shiurim, the Yeshiva University alumni is proud to introduce to you Rabbi Dov Berkovits, who will be giving the second part of his three-part series on national tshuva in a generation of broken vessels. Last week, the focus was on two conceptions of national tshuva, Rabbi Cook and Rav Soloveitchik. This week, the focus will be on the Baal Tshuva movement, breakdown, or preservation. Rabbi Berkovits teaches at Pardes, Makom Pardes. He has smicha from Yeshiva University in 1970. He lives in Shiloh, father of 5 children. Rabbi Berkovits.
That's what's called the Hakal HaKavod. I'm not sure how many of you were here last week. Thank you. 2. As they say back in the classroom, I will assume that all of you who weren't here have gone over the notes of somebody else. Let me just... I hope not. Excuse me, are you going to be... Excuse me.
No.
Standing here all the time?
No.
All right. The cameraman will not be here all the time. A very famous pasuk in Sefer Amos. הנה ימים באים נאום השם אלוהים והשלחתי רעב בארץ לא רעב ללחם ולא צמא למים כי אם לשמוע את דברי השם. Now, free translation. Although the days will come, said Hashem, God Hashem, and I will send a famine into the land, not a famine for bread and not a thirst for water, but to hear the words of Hashem. V'na'u miyam ad yam u'mitzafon v'ad mizrach yishotetu levakesh et divrei Hashem v'lo yimtza'u. And they will wander from sea to sea, from sea to shining sea. Apparently it means from the Mediterranean to the Kinneret. V'na'u miyam ad yam, since Amos is prophesying to the kingdom of Yisrael, and so it probably does not mean Yam Suf, it probably means Yam Kinneret and Yam Tifon. And they will wander from the sea to the sea, from the north to the east. They will wander aimlessly about, seeking the word of Hashem, and it will not be there to be found. Bayom hahu tit'alafna habtulot hayafot v'habachurim b'tzama. In that day, the beautiful girls and the young men will faint from thirst. From the context of these few sentences in Sefer Amos, it would seem that he is speaking specifically to the return of the kingdom of Israel in tshuva from the idol worship that at this point in time dominated the life of the kingdom of Israel. However, throughout the generations, this pasuk has become a description, as it were, of a time to come in the future, when the children of Israel, the young men and women, wander across the country looking for the word of Hashem. And it's difficult to find whatever the authentic, real word of Hashem is. I would like to consider the question this evening as to whether the resurgence, the reawakening of many young people whose life began far away from Torah and Mitzvot, their reawakening, their return to Judaism in one way or another in this generation is the kind of national tshuva, national renaissance, national spiritual renaissance that we all thought would be part of the return of the Jewish people to Israel. We already found last week that both Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rav Kook linked the process of tshuva to the notion of geula, to the notion of redemption. For Rabbi Soloveitchik, tshuva and geula were constantly linked. I think, as I tried to point out last week, in one of the most basic aspects of his thought. Many points in his important articles where he reaches a climax, an attempt to define in a kernel the basis of what he is trying to say, he begins to use the notions of geula to recall, I think, a key sentence in all of Rabbi Soloveitchik's writings, a sentence that appears towards the beginning of The Lonely Man of Faith, in speaking about ha-geula ha-metaheret, the purifying redemption, the experience of redemption that is purifying. היחיד חש כי לחייו יש ערך שהם מעוגנים במציאות יציבה ובלתי משתנה. When an individual experiences life, his life, as having a value which is rooted in a reality which is stable and unchanging. אפשר לזכות בגאולה רק כאשר האדם הענה ועושה צעד של נסיגה ומרשה לעצמו שיהיה נכבש על ידי ישות עליונה ואמיתית יותר. It is possible to merit this experience of redemption only when a person in humility takes one step in retreat, one step backwards, and allows himself to be captured, to be conquered by an existence, by a reality which is greater and truer than he is. That willingness to surrender, to give in, to give up of oneself to something that one experiences as directly and immediately demanding of oneself. That is an experience of geula, and it clearly is the basic experience of tshuva. I tried to develop these ideas a little bit last week. For Rav Soloveitchik, this experience of geula, of redemption, of transformation of self, of total change of personality, of self-creation, in the language of Rabbi Soloveitchik in Isha Halacha, is really the basis of tshuva, and it is an experience of geula. For Rav Kook, this experience does not take place primarily on the plane of the individual's relationship to Torah and Mitzvot, individual's relationship to Hashem. It takes place primarily as an individual connects to the Jewish people. As an individual Jew finds his place in the rebuilding of the Jewish people in this generation, physically or spiritually. HaTshuva ha'elyona, the highest form of tshuva, ba'a mehavraka shel hatov ha'klali. I'll try to translate this. Comes from a flash, havraka, from a flash that of the ultimate, all-encompassing good, hatov ha'klali. Shel hatov ha'elohi, the goodness, the divine good, hashoreh ba'olamot kulam, which exists in all worlds, or chei ha'olamim. The light of the source of all creation. Nishmata shel Knesset Yisrael hi hatzedek hamuchlat. The soul of the Jewish people, or the soul of the Jewish Knesset, of the Knesset of Israel, is absolute righteousness, or absolute justice. I don't know if that's a good translation. Hatzedek hamuchlat. Al kain, kol pagam musari sha'ish ha'yechidi miYisrael oseh. As a result, any individual flaw in the world of ethics and morality that any individual Jew perpetrates, machalishu bazeh kishuro im nishmat ha'umah kula, weakens in that way the connection of that individual to the soul of the Jewish people altogether. As we talked about this last week, it is participation in the redemption of the Jewish people. It is participation in the living, creative forces of the Jewish people in this generation that is, in effect, an act of tshuva. It is, in effect, whether done by a religious quote or non-religious person, for Rav Kook, an act which speaks and reflects of a high form of idealism within this person, which reflects this person's sense of what the Jewish people is, rooted in the sense of the absolute in the world. For both Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rav Kook, tshuva, in one way or another, is an act of transformation, whether of self or of community. Geula of self, geula of the Jewish people. For both Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rav Kook, the words of Amos, which say, Lishmoa et divrei Hashem, there will come a time, says Hashem, that I will cast into the world a famine, not a famine for food, for bread, not a thirst for water, but to hear the words of Hashem. For both Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rav Kook, the tshuva of the Jewish people in this generation, as we talked about it last week, is not a search for a new form of Jewish behaviorism. It is not a search for a new form of halachically detailed life framework which allows a person a sense of identity within a life that is confused, a life that has no direction. That is not the notion of national tshuva. That is not the notion of real tshuva that is related to the idea of geula. For both Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rav Kook, and I believe that in this respect they speak in one voice, the ultimate notion of tshuva comes from a sense of Dvar Hashem, a direct sense of the Word of God in Judaism, a sense of the most profound, highest ideas which underlie all halachot and all mitzvot, that really are the content of the writing of Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rav Kook themselves. Whether in Rav Kook, in which these ideas should reflect the history of Kabbalah, or whether in the writings of Rabbi Soloveitchik where these ideas reflect an in-depth conceptualization of halakha that relies on contemporary philosophical writing. For both Rav Kook and Rabbi Soloveitchik, the power of their thinking is its grand scope, its profound spiritual and philosophical conception. It is an attempt to find within Judaism, in this generation, really Dvar Hashem, the words of God, the creator of the universe, the God that was revealed at Sinai. It seems that the Baal Tshuva movement, without defining what it is yet, I think caught many of us a little by surprise. I remember in the 1950s and 60s, without defining those dates too carefully, there was no real Baal Tshuva movement. If I'm not mistaken, and maybe some of you can correct me, JSP, as it was formerly called, Jewish Studies Program at Yeshiva University, which later became known as JSS, was a radical innovation at the time. The idea of taking young Jews who knew very little, who had no background, who may not have really been totally committed to a life of Torah and mitzvot, and bringing them into a yeshiva to learn Torah. At that time, even the Lubavitcher Rebbe wasn't really doing that a lot yet on campus and around the world. When I was in Bnei Akiva in Chicago, Bnei Akiva was not the seminars of Yeshiva University in terms of finding souls and missionizing. The Bnei Akiva in Chicago every summer took young people from Detroit and St. Louis and Minneapolis who came to Camp Moshava, and everybody knew that one of the goals of bringing these young people to Camp Moshava was to get them to go to the Chicago Jewish Academy during the year. And nobody thought that was missionizing, and nobody even thought that was the Baal Tshuva movement. Nobody thought that we were doing anything that was really very aggressive, because even in our own minds, we thought of ourselves as being really part of the American scene, and we were just adding to them a rich dimension of life that they did not possess. We were supplementing something they did not have. We were not taking anything away. They could keep on memorizing, right, the batting averages. In fact, in the yeshiva, we used to do it more than anybody. There was, at that time, a sense that very little was happening in the way of changing the behavior of young Jews in the direction of Torah and mitzvot. Much more was happening in the other direction. When there were a few young people in Camp Moshava or who came to JSP, it was seen in a sense as an amazing phenomenon. Because if people were changing, they were most of the time changing in the opposite direction. Many of the young rabbis, many of the young rabbanim who left Yeshiva University and went out to the boondocks, left with a message that to a great extent was unique, which tried to combine a personal warmth, a relationship of welcoming to any Jew, with a commitment to halakha, to the framework of halakha, to halacha l'maisa, with the approach of Yeshiva University at the time, which was an attempt to integrate the best of Western thought with the learning of Torah. And it was, I think, with some degree of consternation and discomfort that in the early and middle 1970s, many of us looked at the Baal Tshuva movement and didn't really know exactly how to respond. Felt a little bit ambivalent and even uncomfortable with the development of the yeshivot here in Yerushalayim, especially. Of course, by now things have gone far beyond that. And on every campus there's a Beit Chabad. And even those Jews who are not going to Baalei Tshuva yeshivas, many, perhaps not enough, but many have been influenced and are affected by the new wave of enthusiasm and excitement in Jewish ritual, and even in learning Torah. This wonderful and amazing creation did not come from the community that most of us are part of. But, in fact, came from the much more aggressive communities which have rejected much of the thought of Rabbi Soloveitchik and to a certain extent of Rav Kook. And what I hope to do this evening is to try to understand the nature of the chasm, spiritually and intellectually, between the Baal Tshuva movement and the world that we come from, the world of the thinking as students of Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rav Kook, to try to understand the nature of our discomfort, of our ambivalence, of our love-hate relationship with some of the characteristics of the Baal Tshuva movement. Right from the beginning, let us say this. Both Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rav Kook, each in their own way, attempted to make an integration between certain aspects of Western culture and Judaism. Whether it was in the great intellectual achievements of Rabbi Soloveitchik, and it seems from Rav Kook's writing, although not in the same way, that he too was familiar with Hegel and with other thinkers. But in the case of Rav Kook, clearly the dominant thread of modernity coming out of Western civilization that he attempted to integrate with Judaism was clearly Zionism in many of its forms. Socialism, the idealism of the socialists, and many of the values of Zionism which he attempted to try to integrate with his understanding of Judaism. I believe that one of the basic qualities of the Baal Tshuva movement is the rejection of Western civilization, is the negation of some of the most important aspects of Western civilization that both Rav Kook and Rav Soloveitchik spring from. And I'd like to talk about that aspect. Speaking generally, though, there's a second dimension which I think is critical, which cannot be overlooked. In one of the tshuvas of the Sridei Eish concerning Bat Mitzvah, Sridei Eish, Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg writes towards the end of the tshuva, there is a need to allow a bat mitzvah, although it's not clear whether it should be allowed in Beit Knesset, according to Rabbi Weinberg. But there's a need to allow a bat mitzvah, even though it is an institution that was initiated by Reform Jews, because the situation in the Jewish community today has changed. Once upon a time, a Jew learned and experienced himself and his identity as a Jew from his mother's milk, from the street. You just had to walk down the street of a Jewish community. And becoming and growing as a Jew was a natural phenomenon. Today, becoming Jewish has to be a learned, cognitive assimilation. It is not something that is picked up intuitively before you're 4 years old from the street and from the home. And therefore, there is a need for teaching out of the principle of ahava, meaning, again, teaching the basic principles of Judaism and allowing people who feel that they're outside the community not to feel that way to come in. And many young women, he says, will feel disenfranchised if they see young men being bar mitzvah and they not having a bar mitzvah. The basic point that I wish to make is that both Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Kook, interestingly from Eastern Europe, many of the leaders of modern Orthodoxy, though educated in Western Europe, came from Eastern Europe. An interesting phenomenon that I think should have to be considered. Both Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rav Kook wrote from an experience of context. I think that's the best way to say it. Wrote from an experience of context, from an experience of place. There was no question about context and place. The question of integrating Western civilization was not a question which would ever undermine context and place, because for a man who was at the age of 4 learning Gemara with his father in Eastern Europe and Lithuania, it is very difficult to imagine that that sense of place and context could ever be questioned, could ever be threatened. Those are the two general differences which I believe mark our generation. The response of many of the people who are involved in a return to Judaism. A rejection of that which these two great figures attempted to integrate with Judaism. And the world in which place, context of Jewish community has been lost. Unless you want to live in those communities which attempted to preserve, unchangingly almost, a memory, the image of the world that was destroyed. A number of years ago, this is a generation of broken vessels. Shvirat HaKelim. Many of the kelim, many of the great vessels, both Jewish and human, lie fractured and fragmented. And I'll have to go here a little more quickly than I planned. A number of years ago, when one of the only systematic surveys was done with regard to motivation of many of the young people in the Bali Tshuva Yeshivot here in Yerushalayim, was done by a sociologist at Hebrew University. What she discovered at that time, to her surprise, was that the basic motivation for the tshuva of most of these young people had nothing to do with basic problems of Jewish thought. It wasn't a problem of belief. It wasn't discovery of God, understanding providence, understanding the nature of evil, understanding free will. All the problems that when we went and taught in the seminars was always a place for them. It was always important to speak about the basic problems of Jewish thought, which were necessary in order to help the modern intellectual young person come to terms with Judaism. All of these kinds of questions were not important for most of the people who had become Baalei Tshuva. What was important for them was the escape from a society that was sexually free and was dominated by drugs. The possibility of living in a society that did not believe in sexual permissiveness was the number one element, the number one motivation given by the people who were interviewed. Many of the characteristics of Western society, I need not go into them, have led many young people to feel without anchor, without roots, without identity, at a loss, the breakdown of the family, divorce, a lifestyle, especially on campuses, this is something that many young people were fleeing, were trying to escape, were trying to find some kind of place in the world that was stable, that was rooted, that was something that could be relied on, that would give them an identity. Clothes, a uniform, a community that loves them, a community that will set them up with a wife, give them a shidduch, and worry about them, and invite them for Shabbat into a warm home. Who needs Hegel? If what you need in this world is a little bit of love and a little bit of stability and an anchor to your sense of identity. Once upon a time, even the Apikoros in Judaism, you could sense it, even the Apikoros was a Jew. Even the man who kept his store open on Shabbat on the Lower East Side spoke with a Yiddish accent and rooted for the Brooklyn Dodgers. You read Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem is full of Apikorsim who are more Jewish than some. I won't finish the sentence. I remember the first time I went to a neo-Jewish wedding here in Yerushalayim and saw a young man with a large kippah and tzitzis flying, dressed like a hippie, dancing like nothing I had seen before in the world. Although later I discovered that this first and second generation Hasidim may have danced the same way. But I didn't know where this person came from. Tzitzis out and looking like he just came from Greenwich Village, I'm sorry to date myself, was a combination that was just impossible. I had come from New York, where supposedly, if you looked one way, you didn't look the other way. If you went to Greenwich Village, you didn't go with your tzitzis out. And here were people whose whole inner world was these two things together. I remember my father saying to me once something which I think is more telling than that, and that is that once upon a time, you could tell who was a Talmid Chacham in the community by who sported a beard. There were differences. There are some people who grew beards and some people who didn't grow beards. And everybody knew who could grow beards. And now, my father said, you can't tell the difference anymore. Now understand what that means. In the breakdown and the fragmentation of Jewish community life, in the destruction of the Jewish communities in Europe, and the breaking down of the walls of the Jewish community in the emancipated world of America, it's difficult to find real standards. Everybody's a tzaddik. Everybody's on the way to God. Everybody's learning with Nachman. Everybody learns. This has nothing to do with competition. Everybody learns with Nachman. Everybody tries, feels that they're on a spiritual path. This summer, I had the opportunity to spend a few weeks in the Rova HaYehudi here in Jerusalem. The summer, it was just amazing. It's like it was like a shuk. It was like a shuk of Jewish spirituality. You walk down the street, doors are wide open. Here there's a video playing. There's a song. Here there's somebody giving a lecture, and there are people wandering in here from all over the world looking for somebody to teach them Torah, somebody to talk about Jewish spirituality. Who's a Rebbe? Who's a rabbi? Who's a Talmud Chacham? Who can really speak in depth of the history of Emunah and Yirat Shamayim and Ahavas Torah? Everybody. As long as there are 10 people who come in and have a feeling that this person is a Rebbe, he's a Rebbe. Maybe that's being too hard and too critical, but to a certain extent, it seems to me, that along with the breakdown of family and personal structures of personal life, the Churban of the Jewish people has left us with very few communities. Once upon a time, a Jew walked into the synagogue in Berlin, into the synagogue in Pressburg, into the synagogue in Vilna, into the synagogue in Prague, into the synagogue in Baghdad, and he was walking into a tradition of 500 years of Rabbonim, of Tuvei Ha'ir, of traditions. One of the fascinating things about Jewish history is that if we look at the major periods, the major eras of Jewish community life, we will find that every era ends with a great destruction which leads to the creation of something new. The destruction of the Ashkenazi communities in the early 14th century, the destruction of the Sephardi communities in the 15th century, was basically the destruction of medieval Judaism that allowed for the creation of the great intellectual and spiritual communities in Poland in the 16th and 17th century, where Judaism didn't look exactly the same. And there was always a period in between of loss and destruction and searching when the communities were destroyed. There were three major periods of destruction, I believe, in the life of the Jewish people. The destruction of the community of the Mishnah in Eretz Yisrael, between the Churban HaBayit and the final conclusion of the exile of the Jews from Eretz Yisrael to Babel in approximately the year 300, 350, when 1,500 years of Jewish existence in Israel came to an end. The destruction of the Jewish communities of the Middle Ages, the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim, 100 years apart, and the great destruction of the exile, in the language of my father, Churban Galut, the great destruction of the exile in the 20th century in our lifetime. The Jewish people created a Judaism which survived in Galut. The Ashkenazi Galut and the Sephardi Galut. Where is it? Where is it? The continuity of Jewish life, of Jewish community life. Located. Show me where are the communities that survive? That continue the traditions, the standards, the expectations of excellence, and the knowledge of what those expectations mean. There are not many left. I'll say aloud a thought which I think to myself usually. I've spoken to a few people about it, which I believe is of great significance. In this decade, the greatest Gedolim who carried in them, who carried with them for us the continuity of hundreds of years of Torah learning, are dying. In each community, Reb Tzvi Yehuda, Reb Moshe Feinstein, Shivadel HaChaim HaUkim, the Rav. Each one, the intellectual and spiritual giant that led a whole community. Lo Alman Yisrael. There is always a sense of the past dying and we being smaller. But it seems to me that at this time something is happening which is maybe, I say this very quietly, maybe of a different kind. Because it's not clear that the next generation which follows has in each community someone of the same stature to take their place. And if this is happening in many communities, then it is not a coincidence. It is a deep running current within our time that has to be thought about. There is a breakdown. Family, community frameworks, traditions. And of course, let me say quickly, in the context of a breakdown in the belief, as Rabbi Furman put it last week, the breakdown of faith in faith, of belief in belief. This is the way Heschel writes it, I think, in a way that's worth reading. Modern man is gradually recovering from the shock of realizing that intellectually he has no right to dream anymore, no right to mourn his lost craving for that which he may need, but to which he has become indifferent. He has indeed long since ceased to trust his will to believe, or even his grief about the loss of a desire to believe. A shudder stalks through our nights. There is no house in our cities without at least one soul wailing in the midst of joy. terrified by achievement, dismayed at the servitude to needs, at the inability to trust what he is cherishing. What applies to moral judgments holds true in regard to religious beliefs. It has long been known that need and desire play a part in the shaping of beliefs. But is it true, as modern psychology often claims, that our religious beliefs are nothing but attempts to satisfy subconscious wishes? That the conception of God is merely a projection of self-seeking emotions, an objectification of subjective needs, the self in disguise? Indeed, the tendency to question the genuineness of man's concern about God is a challenge no less serious than the tendency to question the existence of God. Let me read that sentence again. Indeed, the tendency to question the genuineness of man's concern about God is a challenge no less serious than the tendency to question the existence of God. We are in greater need of a proof for the authenticity of faith than of a proof for the existence of God. There's no time to go into all of the many cultural and social causes that have given rise to this feeling in the society that we live in. Rabbi Lamb, about a year ago, wrote a very important article about God in the school in the United States, not just in Jewish schools, in which he wrote that what we have lost is a sense of human dignity. That somewhere in modern society there's a connection between the loss of belief in belief and a loss of a basic sense of dignity that all human beings carry with them, that societies carry with them. There is a fascinating paradox in which one discovers that belief and surrender to a God somehow does not deny human beings an autonomous place in the world, but in fact provides a ground for giving human beings his dignity. And somewhere in modern civilization, with technology, with the dignity of the scientist being replaced by the database, and with many of the events of the Shoah, etc., AIDS and crack, etc., there is little left of real self-respect for a human creature in much of modern civilization. Let me finish up here, conclude my remarks, although there's much more that I had prepared, by speaking of the Baal Tshuva movement in this context in two ways. It is clear that for a young person growing up in a world like this, Kierkegaard and Hegel and Kant are really not important. Not only are they not important, but they miss the point altogether. Because the question for many young Jews in this generation, beyond finding an anchor and finding an identity and finding a little corner of this world where there is real love, I believe, as Rabbi Frumer began to talk about this last week, there is a great need to understand the relationship between belief in God and coming to terms with my own emotional problems, my own emotional needs, my own sense of self. One of the most difficult questions about the Baal Tshuva movement for me, for many years, was that it was never clear to me if what we were talking about was God and Torah and mitzvot, or a group of people emotional needs that they were using Torah and mitzvot and God in order to meet. And everything that I had learned, although I think I was unaware of this, led me to think that when a Jew uses Torah, uses a mitzvah to satisfy an ego need, it's an avodah zarah. It's something which is really a worship of self. It's really using the ultimate, the absolute, to gain a need which is really personal and has nothing to do with the truth, the objective truth of what Judaism is based on. There is a section in Orot Tshuva which I had remembered, and I looked for about an hour to find it in this Orot Tshuva, and then discovered that it was not in this edition. I put it in the 5th edition of Orot Tshuva, and so I can't read it to you directly. In which Rav Kook talks about the fact that sometimes a person is unable to do tshuva for reasons of physical weakness. He's weak physically, he's sick. Or he has some psychological problems, he's unable to do tshuva. He really wants to do tshuva in terms of his, religious search. But something gets in the way, he's not able to do tshuva, that really has nothing to do with Torah, mitzvot, emunah, religion, neshama, nefesh. Says Rav Kook, hein gufei Torah. These are the, how we translate it, Mishnah in Chagiga, is the very building blocks. These are the components of Torah. If this is what prevents you from doing tshuva, then dealing with that problem is migufo shel Torah. Somewhere it seems to me that our education, looking back, and perhaps some of you will jump up, and if you're still have the strength to jump up after all this harangue here, and disagree with what I'm about to say. Somewhere in our education, I think, at Yeshiva University, there was an all too great reliance on the power of the intellect and the realm of the intellect to create our sense of emunah, our sense of the integration of this world, of the generation that we live in, with the tradition of Torah and mitzvot. If one could sit in a philosophy class and study Plato and Aristotle in the afternoon and learn Bava Kama in the morning, and then successfully bridge the gap between those two worlds intellectually, we felt that we had created a world that was integrated. But a world that is integrated must be integrated first of all within the personality of real human beings. And the personality of real human beings does not operate solely on the realm of the intellect. The personality of real human beings, first of all, operates with the need for love and the possibility of creating meaningful human relationships with parents, with peers, and with children. And Judaism that is able to give me an answer for my needs on that level is a Judaism that speaks in a language that I can use to integrate my life as it is here in the present with Torah and mitzvot. The Gemara that came to my mind was a Gemara in Brachot, in which the pasuk with David, Shamra nafshi ki chasid ani. Perek in Tehillim for David, or by David, it's David, Shamra nafshi ki chasid ani. My nefesh has protected me because I'm a chasid. Levi v'Rabbi Yitzchak. Chad amar, once said, Kach amar David b'fnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribbono shel Olam, לא חסיד אני, שכל מלכי מזרח ומערב ישנים עד 3 שעות ואני חצות הלילה אקים להודות לך? Am I not a Hasid because all of the great kings of the east and the west sleep longer than anyone else till 3 hours in the morning? They don't have to go to work. And I get up in the middle of the night to sing the praises of Hashem. V'idach, and the other one said, Kach amar David, lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is what David said before Hashem. Ribono shel olam lo chasidani, am I not a Hasid? Shekol malchei mizrach u'ma'arav yoshvim agudot bichvodam. That all of the kings of the east and the west sit in their honor and groups, one group and another group. Va'ani yadai meluchlachot b'dam u'v'shapir u'v'shalyah. And my hands, I get dirty in blood and in the, how do you say it in English? Shapir u'shalyah. The embryo of, and the afterbirth of a woman, kedei letaher isha leba'ala, in order to make a woman tahor for her husband. The kings sit and don't get their hands dirty. And this is not to say that many educators and rabbis left Yeshiva University and went out to the most difficult parts of the United States and got their hands very dirty. But in this respect, somehow it seems to me that we have a kind of bewilderment and perhaps even a sense of discomfort when we see young people so deeply involved in their own emotional needs and problems, their own attempt to build their own life within the limitations of their own problems, and using Torah and mitzvot in order to do so. That dam shapir v'shalyah, I'm not sure if we got our hands dirty in it, or we feel that there's some kind of a, it's not really Torah mitzvot in the same way that we were. Speak of it's not emet leman emet. The second, perhaps let me conclude here with a concluding remark. And perhaps in the questions and answers, if there are any, I may be able to. Every week's exactly at the same time to develop some of the points that I was not able to get to. The Rambam in Perek Bet, in a very well-known section, writes as follows in Perek Bet of the Tshuva: Midarkei Tshuva, the path is among the path of Tshuva, the method of Tshuva. Liot Hashav Tzoek Tamid, that the person who repents should cry out continuously Lifnei Hashem, before God. An experience of standing in the presence of God and crying out to God. Bivichi, in tears, ubetachanunim, in supplications. V'yoseh tzedakah kefi kocho, and he should give or do tzedakah as he is able to. Umitrachek harbei min hadavar shechata bo, and he should distance himself as far as possible from that sin which he was involved with. Umeshaneh shmo, and he should change his name. Klomar, that is to say, ani acher, I'm somebody else. I'm not the same person that I was. Ve'eni oto ish asa otam ha'ma'asim, I'm not the same person that did those actions. Umeshaneh ma'asav kulam l'tova, v'lederech yeshara v'golem mikomo. Shouldn't have said that quickly. Changes his actions all for the good, to the right, to the straight path, and goes into exile from his place. Rabbi Soloveitchik in Al Tshuva, in talking about Tshuva Miyira and Tshuva Me'ahava, points to this section and says, sometimes to do Tshuva means to totally reject my past, to change my name, to be a different person, to go to a different place, to dress in different clothes, to throw everything away that was me in the past, because that's the only way I can deal with who I used to be. Sometimes a chet is so powerful that the only way to deal with it is not to come to terms with it. Not to integrate it somehow within my life. To say, that world is something that may still have hold on me, may still have a power on me. The only way I can get rid of it is by changing my name, changing my clothes, going to a different place, and becoming a different person. Says Rav Soloveitchik, that is the basic quality of tshuva miyira. Of tshuva out of fear, and we'll define that finally in a minute. A person who does tshuva me'ahava, who does tshuva out of love of the Torah, love of mitzvot, love of Hashem, out of acknowledgement of the emet, because it is the emet, as the Rambam says. An acknowledgement of the truth because it's the truth. That person, says the Rambam, says Rabbi Soloveitchik, that person does not need to reject the past. Does not need to say, I will go to a different place, change my clothes, become a different person, change my name. Because that person takes the dimension of personality, which is full of some kind of life force, which has led me to sin, and integrate it into my life today, even in terms of that power which led me to sin. But now that I have, in a sense, transcended those actions, by attaching myself to a higher sense of the presence of Hashem in my life, I am able to take that dynamic force which led me to hate, and to turn it around and to take that same force, that same motivation which led me to hate, and to have me do a mitzvah with the same motivation and the same force of personality. And so a person who does tshuva me'ahava need not reject his past at all. Need not reject that part of himself which led him to hate. It's a question of control of time and control of past. One of the great acts of creativity in the writings of Rav Soloveitchik in his understanding of tshuva. I think in this context, one can say that when the Rambam talks about tshuva miyira at the end of Hilchot Tshuva, and says, Al yomar adam hareini oseh mitzvot haTorah ve'osek b'chokmata kadei she'akabel kol habrachot haktuvot ba. A person shouldn't say, I'm going to do the mitzvot in the Torah and be engaged in the wisdom of Torah in order to receive the blessings that are written in the Torah. Or kadei she'ezkeh l'chayei olam haba, in order to merit the life of the world to come. He develops these ideas in Hagdama L'Perek Chelik. A person shouldn't say that, because a person should do these mitzvot and be engaged in chokhmah out of ahava, lishma. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. Lo mipnei davar ba'olam, not for anything in the world. V'lo mipnei yirat ha'ra'ah, not because of the fear of evil. Ela oseh ha'emet mipnei shu emet. They should do that which is true because it's true. It would seem to me, to say very simply, that the Baal Tshuva movement is one of the great expressions of Tshuva Meira, of an authentic search for a greater understanding of the wisdom of Torah, for a greater connection to Hashem, based on a need within this world. Perhaps a higher need than my desire for reward or my fear of punishment. A need to integrate myself, a need to find a way to live with other human beings, a need to search for a place in the world that gives me identity and gives me an anchor and gives me a framework, it gives me a sense of dignity, and all of the things we talked about. In a world of broken vessels, one needs to rebuild the basic frameworks of life for an individual and for a community. And this has been the great achievement of those communities who brought back many young people to Judaism. But in humility, I would say, for many, at least the beginning of that path, hopefully not the end of that path, the beginning of that path is mipnei davar sheba'olam, is because of something in this world, something that has to do with personal, individual life, emotional need, family, community. And it is that that has brought many young people to Judaism, to learning, to keeping Torah mitzvah. The question remains, is the Baal Tshuva movement something that will bring the many young, and now not so young, professionals, seekers, to a real tshuva me'ahava? Not only on an individual basis, that is, it's something that can reshape the character of the Jewish people. Clearly, one of the characteristics of the Baal Tshuva movement, which I didn't have time to talk about, is its power to polarize the Jewish people. To drive a deeper wedge between those who are committed to Torah mitzvot and those who are not. The possibility of tshuva me'ahava is finally described in a pasuk in Yoel, by which I'll conclude here. והיה אחרי כן אשפוך את רוחי על כל בשר וניבאו בניכם ובנותיכם זקניכם חלומות יחלומו בחוריכם חזיונות יראו וגם על העבדים ועל השפחות בימים ההם אשפוך את רוחי. And after what I have just described, I will pour out my spirit on all creatures, on all flesh. And your sons and daughters will prophesy. They will not wander from sea to sea, searching the word of God and not finding. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. The elders in your community will dream dreams, and your young men will see visions. And even on the slaves, on the servants, and the maidservants, in those days I will pour out my spirit. What I hope to talk about next week is what kind of tshuva me'ahava we in this community, as students of Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rav Kook, can suggest for ourselves and for the Jewish people as a whole. A tshuva that hopefully will lead to the experience described here in Sefer Yoel.
But this is such a great idea where the Jewish people are so divided. Which people do you mean? The people in Israel or the people that are going from to Australia? I understand that the paper says there's a very big Jewish community growing up in Australia. They don't like Israel, they don't like America. Now, which Jewish people do you mean? Here we have the movement. They're terribly criticized. They don't go. People, the non-religious say that they don't go to the army. They don't do this.
Can everybody hear?
They're arousing only the people against us that are for.
It seems to me that the kind of phenomena that you're talking about are related to the fact, or to the factors that I tried to talk about this evening. It's difficult to speak about Jewish people as one people. It's difficult to prevent polarization. It's difficult to prevent the breakdown of our sense of unity between many, many different kinds of Jews in a generation after the destruction. In a generation after the destruction. In a generation after the destruction of a Jewish life that created and fulfilled itself for hundreds and hundreds of years and was destroyed within a time span of 5 years in terms of Ashkenazic Jews and of a little longer in terms of Sephardi Jews whose Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, for one reason or another, led to the breakdown of community life. It's very difficult that there shouldn't be many different kinds of phenomena of fragmentation and polarization in a period of this kind. Until the vessels get rebuilt, until the communities get rebuilt in the way that is mat'im, in a way that is appropriate for the state of Israel and the United States in this time and in this generation. Something that after the destruction of the Spanish, after the Spanish Inquisition in the end of the 15th century, it took 3 generations just for the community in Tzfat to be created. It took the Ashkenazic Jews 150 years to rebuild Ashkenazic Judaism on the basis of the traditions that they carried with them across Bohemia and Moravia into Poland. It took generations to rebuild. To rebuild in a way that once again created a vibrant, effective community life, intellectual life, spiritual life. The need, in my humble opinion today, is to look for small seeds and to begin to plant. That's what I hope to talk about next week. But it certainly, at this time, much of what is happening, both as in terms of the life of the Jews here in Israel, and in terms of the life of Torah mitzvot, it's clear that the powers that separate don't have the strength of community and traditions and the things that I tried to talk about today to counter them. And that is why it is a time of great pain to live as a Jew who is committed in any way, because of tremendous losses that the Jewish people are suffering in this generation. Ken, anybody else? Ken?
Sort of downgrade and more downgrade the people that they through the concept of tshuva through the fact of that. So
It's difficult for me to hear, I'm
that
sorry.
had problems with the law, especially. You mentioned that it's almost like a little bizarre. Right? And I was wondering, if you get away a little bit from the concept of the Dov Berkovits.
Correct. That's exactly the language that I was intending at the end in speaking about Tshuva Me'irah, in identifying the Baal Tshuva movement as a form of Tshuva Me'irah, which leads in the end of Yochot Tshuva, according to the Rambam, to the notion that you just mentioned. Mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma. On the other hand, I wish to emphasize again something which I think is critical, and that is that how should I say this? When you meet a young Jew today whose understanding of what emunah is, whose understanding of learning and doing mitzvot seems to come from the emotional biography of this person. Comes from so-and-so kind of family, the broken family. He wandered around, took drugs in so-and-so campus, moved from here to there, came across, was at the kotel, didn't know really why he was here at the kotel. Somebody, tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Would you like to spend the night Shabbos with us?" If you look carefully and understand carefully what some of these people say about what they believe in, you can sense that what they're talking about is not emet biglal shu emet. It's not objective. It's something that has provided them with a solution to some very basic personal problems. What I meant to say was that I think it is very important that we create some kind of language so that we understand how to relate, how to evaluate, how to appreciate, how to teach people like that. And I said the word avodah zarah because I think that in teaching people like that, it's very important to try to help them understand the role or the relationship between emunah and, emotional needs, personal needs. Lo yeh b'cha el zar. Right? It's already the Gemara that says that the el zar is in you. Of course, the Gemara talks about kas, anger, and jealousy. That avodah zarah can begin within you. This, I believe, is a very basic problem in dealing with some of the phenomena of the Baal Tshuva movement today. It's something that I'm not sure that enough thought has by Gdolei Torah, who are the ones who have to give thought to questions like this. Enough thought has been given to this aspect of the question, and I think it's a question that Dafka for us, from the background that we came from, gave many people, I think, like us, a lot of problems. In the end, I agree with you. Mitoch shelo lishma, ba lishma. And as a result, I believe it's a tremendously positive phenomenon that many young people are learning Torah mitzvot for whatever reason, even if it isn't perhaps the highest, if it isn't the highest form of tshuva for every one of those people. It is a tremendous achievement for the Jewish people, and I think we should be happy. And mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma. Ken, you had a question back there. Ken.
You described it in sort of terms of American terms, in the sense of it's partly the Shuvah Mirayah as a response to kind of deprivation of contemporary America, which I would agree with. I just wondered if you could also comment on the Israeli response, typifying it as an American.
Right. I don't know if I have time to do that. I'm not sure that I, not being as involved, let's say, with Israelis as much as with people who have an American background like myself, I'm not sure I even understand it or at least have as much experience. I wanted to talk a little bit about that in terms of Gush Emunim. Sorry I mentioned that word, but let's leave that for next year. I'm sorry. Let's
So
just,
is the answer that's different? I mean, in other words, was you typifying it as an American phenomenon? Was that
I think that let me put it this way. There's many of the things that I tried to talk about today, I think are true in Israel as well. I think that in certain respects they're not as severe. At least not yet, and I hope they never will be. But certainly not as severe, but I think that there's some of the things we talked about this evening affect many young people in Israel. However, I think there are other factors as well.
Well, I think that perhaps at this one point, in Israel, it's more severe. Because in Israel, those who went from the Bohemian Israel culture, the bankruptcy of Jewish communism, Buddhism, socialism, to the world of nothing, they're the ones, like Uri Zohar and others, who went all the way to the other extreme. Because they really were inundated. And they needed an exile from that exile. Because that exile is really the one that was cut off completely from everything Jewish value. While in the States, I don't know if they really immersed themselves yet in the full tumor. And there they can go into NCSY, they can go into NIFTY, they can go into USY, which again we should see in a positive sense, radically, because they're conservative reform. So I would like to to everyone sitting here because he presented what many people from the YU school who see the Baal Tshuva movement in a negative sense is threatening the world of synthesis and integration. These people have rejected us. They have rejected the idea that we can live in both worlds. They have come into the exile from the modern world, and they've gone all the way. But we have to, and I think this is something that you maybe want us to understand, we have to ask ourselves in all honesty, which is better? Somebody who lives a world of total hedonism or a world of awesome. Even though that I would prefer something else, but if it's an either or, which is better? A world of complete socialist atheism, or a world of Frumkeit, which is a different Frumkeit than ours, but nonetheless moral and closer to Hashem.
Let me just say two things quickly about that. First of all, I think it's interesting to note that many Baalei Tshuva, especially I think in the United States, I'm not so sure here, but especially in the United States, are young professionals now who remain committed to their profession, and yet at the same time have added to it the kind of tshuva experience that we tried to describe tonight. Now, that's really strange. On the one hand, I believe it's a success. It's an achievement of the world of Yeshiva University. And I don't mean just to say that, for the pat on the back. I think that I just saw in the paper a few days ago that the Lubavitcher Rebbe wants to build, I think in Yerushalayim, a new shchuna of 1,000 dirot for olim from Russia who are professional scientists, the best Russian intelligentsia who hopefully will come to Israel soon, who are Lubavitch. Excuse me?
He built her.
I don't know. The Lubavitch Rebbe can do a lot, but I thought it was. So I think that the idea of being able to be professionally involved in contemporary society, and at the same time be committed to the world of tshuva is something which I'm not sure existed 30 years ago outside of Yeshiva University, but I think it's something that is a norm in many communities today, even not of all the Baalei Tshuva communities, but in many of them. What is not done is that what it does, though, is that it creates a certain kind of schizophrenia. In other words, you go to your job, you become very involved in your profession, in your occupation. At 1 o'clock, you go to this closed-circuit TV where you sit and learn Gemara with the rabbi from Muncie, right? And then you go back to your work and you come home where your own attitudes and ideas and beliefs are basically a rejection of the social and cultural world, which is the underpinning of the concern that you just went and worked at. I don't know if I said that clearly, but that, at least what I found in recent visits to the United States, there are a number of communities that are growing that are like that are in a sense schizophrenic, but are very successful in that respect, because it allows a person to live in two different worlds, both of which are important to them, without feeling threatened. What Yeshiva University was once about was what we would all call synthesis, which was an intellectual bridging of the two worlds, right? Which, as I said today, is either not relevant, not important, and for many of these people also impossible, and something that they refuse to accept. Because intellectually and spiritually, for them, these two worlds are in conflict. Although professionally, they're able to in fact, live in both worlds. The second thing I'll say much more quickly is that I'm still not Convinced. I'm still a lover of Rav Kook enough to say that somewhere out there in Israel, there are still people who are socialists who really believe in it. I'm not sure that there are a lot left, but I think that there are some. I'm not sure that it's all, although the kind of Baalei Tshuva that you've talked about, I think you're right, and the examples that you mentioned. But I'm not sure that that there aren't other people for whom the bridging of the gap between what they believe in today, and Torah and mitzvot wouldn't be of another kind because they still have a very positive and idealistic sense of being a Jew. I think those people are less and less, but I still think there are some still there. Okay. Yes,
I want to throw out a concern, which may or may not have basis, but at least it communicated itself to me, and I thought I wanted to at least express myself as one who would be very wary of what I'm concerned about. And that is, I'm terribly wary of an attempt in finding a solution and substituting perfections. That is, I don't want an either or, because I honestly don't believe the human being can be sliced up that way. Each one of us is going to find our own Tselem Elokim, which the Almighty has planted within us, if we take it seriously. If so, we ought not to discard the better because we cannot achieve the best. And I would like to hope that the distinction between the tshuva, which is miyah, and the tshuva, which is done mi'ahava, should not be hierarchical. Namely, that the tshuva miyah is lower than the tshuva of mi'ahava, which seems to emerge from the Rambam's definitions. But here, I think if you philosophically, you find also these kind of chopping up. And I'm hoping that when you reach point 3, or lecture 3, that none of us will go away and feel that Rabbi Berkovits, in his integrity and his wisdom, has given us now a perfect pill. If so, I think it would destroy everything you're aiming for.
So you don't have to worry about that. In terms of Tshuva mi'ahava and Tshuva mi'yirah, I don't know. You may be right. I don't know. Something that's worth thinking about. We'll take one more question.
It seems to me that, would you agree that somebody who grew up in a nice, comfortable, healthy, religious environment and who continues to serve God, from that upbringing, is also self-serving?
Well, this goes.
Because it's something that's so natural and comfortable to him.
This goes back to Rabbi Fruma's point. In other words, yes, the question that was raised here tonight, specifically with regard to the Baal Tshuva movement, can be asked perhaps with regard to any human being, because every person has an emotional biography, and there is some kind of connection between who that person is and the Tselem Elohim that he creates for himself from within the limitations of his own life. Yes, and it's certainly true that someone raised in an Orthodox house may express his belief in Hashem and may have a relationship with Torah and mitzvot, which does have something to do with his own personal emotional makeup. Right. This is opening up a very serious question, but and it does have something to do with bringing together the notion of Tshuva mi'ahava and Tshuva mi'yirah. But I think that in terms of the Baal Tshuva movement, it's especially apparent and especially significant and especially important, because I think that what is brought, well, let me put it this way, both in terms of the biographies of the people involved, and especially in terms of comparing it to the world in which we came from, and the thinking of Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rav Kook, where in fact the path to tshuva comes from, in a sense, a much more conceptual, philosophical, cognitive, perhaps, understanding of the profound depths of Judaism. When compared to that, what happened, or what is happening to many young people in the Baal Tshuva movement is especially, is especially apparent. And it's not quite the same, or not quite as strong as what is true of every Jew in terms of their own belief. Hope that's clear. All right, we have to stop.